believe that the gradual awakening his conciencia experienced throughout his pastorate was the true miracle of his calling. The memory of his transformation is one that gives me hope at a time when incessant pleas for change and a halt to the extractivism, displacement, violence, and grave human rights abuses, including massive genocide, seem to fall on deaf ears. A time when the situation worldwide seems so bleak and helpless. I was about 9 years old when I first watched the film Romero. Mind you, with the PG-13 rating, I was still a tad bit young to watch it. But alas, as was habitual of our Sundays, we sat together as a family in my godparents' tiny living room and watched this much anticipated biopic of an individual that has been a source of courage and hope for Salvadorans worldwide. It was 1990, and the war that unraveled as Romero's life was tragically ended continued as bloody as ever. The film was one of the first sources to present me with context about why my parents and I were living in the US and not in El Salvador. As the elders discussed the flaws of this Hollywood representation of a person that had been so emblematic in their youth, I wanted to know more about an individual who seemed to give so much, and that despite the terror, the threats, and violence he endured in his final years, kept pushing forward, defending the poor, denouncing the human rights abuses, and calling out the military forces, National Guard, death squads to cease the repression once and for all. Nonetheless, this cry for an end to the violence that had engulfed the tiny nation by the 80s was the final appeal as the following day, March 24th, 1980, Romero's life was ended by a single bullet to the heart as he officiated a private mass in the chapel of the Divine Providence Hospital in San Salvador. The voice of the voiceless had been silenced, but his teachings, his practice, his legacy lived on in the struggle, la lucha del pueblo salvadoreño. Monseñor Oscar Arnulfo Romero Galdames was born on August 15, 1917, in Ciudad Barrio San Miguel. Romero was the second of 8 children. At a very young age, he was certain that what he wanted in life was to become a priest. His sister Zaida recalls, what he enjoyed most as a kid were the processions. He would throw on my mom's apron and go out on the street and call the other kids to join him, already dreaming that he was a priest. At 13, Oscar kept fussing that he wanted to be a priest. So my mom packed up all his clothes and he left, first for the lower seminary in San Miguel, and later for the upper in San Salvador. And then he went to finish his studies in Rome. He lived in that city during the World War, so my brother was absent from the family and Ciudad Barrios for many years. Romero officiated his first Mass in his native Ciudad Barrios on January 11, 1944, at a young 27 years of age. He was loved in his hometown. The people admired his discipline and humility. In Maria López Vigil's book, Piezas para un Retrato, Memories in Mosaic, one follower explains, want me to be frank? Father Romero, friend of the poor and friend of the rich. He would tell the rich, love the poor, and to us, the poor, he would say, love God, as only he knows what he's doing when he puts you last in line. In the end, you'll have access to heaven. And the heaven that he preached to us would only be accessible to the rich that gave charity, and to the poor that did not fight back. Several accounts in López Vigil's book about his early years as a priest describe a serious man devoted to his faith and his pueblo. He opened church doors to the poor, housed them, fed them, clothed them, and even embraced the drunks and the ill-fated, as another narrative suggests. But what did he understand or think about the social injustices that vexed the greater part of the Salvadoran populace during this time? In the first years of his order, he was described as the pastor of the lambs and the wolves, as he remained impartial and disconnected from the country's socio-political reality, perhaps why he was so adored by the wealthy. This is especially evident from the testimonies offered about his work as the parish priest of San Miguel from 1944 to 1967. In effect, the aforementioned narrative that suggests his belief that the poor would enter heaven so long as they did not fight back, and that the rich would access it by giving to the poor, shows that at that particular moment of his personal and professional journey, Romero had not developed the consciousness about why or how to admonish the violent, exploitative, and unjust conditions affecting Salvadorans all around. As a result of the continued reign of the 14 families, a vicious oligarchy that stole lands and controlled most, if not all, of the country's assets. The following account also demonstrates how even 22 years into his order, when he was named Auxiliary Bishop of San Salvador in 1967, he remained very quiet despite the growing instability the country was experiencing on the political front, and removed himself from spaces within the clergy that were building a resistance effort within the church. I did not like him. He was insignificant, a shadow that spent his time stuck to walls. From the moment he arrived in San Salvador, Father Romero decided to reside at the San Jose de la Montaña Seminary. Who knows why? We, a community of Jesuits, lived there. But he never ate or had dinner or breakfast with us. He would go down to the dining area whenever we weren't there. It was clear that he did everything to avoid us, that he arrived in San Salvador with so many prejudices. We never saw him in any sort of pastoral activity. He did not have a parish and did not attend any of the clergy meetings. And when he did go, he hid in a corner and never opened his mouth. He was afraid to confront the priests that were super active, that were radicalizing their thinking with everything that was going on in the country, which was so much. And he preferred to stay in his office amongst his paperwork, or walking in his black robe, praying around the halls. Shortly after he arrived in San Salvador, we had a pastoral week that was a real shaker-upper. Everything went into high gear and became more radicalized. Plans were laid out, meetings, communities, thousands of things. He remained on the sidelines, and then he took a side. But it was the wrong side. Much was being commented about his relation to some of the Opus Dei priests. He had his own work, which was not ours. He totally started off on the wrong foot. In 1968, just 1 year after being named Auxiliary Bishop of San Salvador, the Latin American Catholic bishops gathered at Medellin, Colombia. They spoke of the institutionalized sin that afflicted and oppressed the majority of people in Latin America. And they called the whole church to take on a preferential option for the poor. For a long time, Romero wanted nothing to do with this. He squelched community-based pastoral projects that he felt were too radical. He protected the status quo. And boy, did he ever protect the status quo. On March 25th, 1972, there was a popular uprising in San Salvador. It was the perfect excuse to declare martial law and establish a curfew throughout the country. The hunt for political opposition was underway, and the repression was ruthless. I was finishing my theology and went to celebrate Holy Week in El Carmen, a small town in San Miguel. The military arrived on Holy Thursday and arrested half a dozen campesinos who were nowhere to be found thereafter. On Holy Saturday, after having been tortured and killed, their cadavers were tossed at the town entrance. I felt myself die of distress and helplessness. On Monday, I went to see the bishop in San Miguel, Eduardo Alvarez, who is also a colonel in the military, with close ties to the military for years. "What do you want me to do?" he asked when I told him about the murders. "I would like you to go to El Carmen to console these people. They need it. They really need it. They asked for this. Now they need to deal with it." That was his only response. I felt even more powerless and outraged that I nearly choked. Since I had known Monsignor Romero for years, I went to San Salvador to talk with him. I told him everything. He seemed disturbed and somewhat hurt by Bishop Alvarez's response. "So will you go to El Carmen?" I dared to ask him. "Of course not. I don't find it prudent to do that." "But Monsignor," "what you should do is go to the nuncio. Tell him what's going on. He should be informed about this." The nuncio was a really good friend of the recently, fraudulently elected President Molina. At the end of the Molina government, after the failure of the agrarian reform, a tremendous repression against campesinos unfolded. And too began the persecution against the church. In February, 4 priests were tortured and expelled from the country as they were foreigners. There were raids and threats against religious folk, a very ugly situation. Monsignor Chavez asked to accelerate the process of his replacement so that his substitute could take on the crisis. When he found out that Monsignor Romero was going to be his replacement, he became very discouraged. After all, he had been his auxiliary for 4 years, and knew very well about his limitations. It's interesting how the Holy See did not take into consideration my recommendation of Monsignor Rivera, who is always my candidate, and they knew it. 40 years as Archbishop, and they did not take my suggestion into consideration. He was hurt. Perhaps those in Rome feared that Rivera, although far from being a combatant, knew how to debate based on his knowledge of the law. This turkey, as they would call Rivera, is a communist and will cause us so many problems. Perhaps in Rome the thinking was that Romero was better because he was easy to manipulate. I share these third-person accounts of Romero's early, careless demeanor with regards to oppression, not as a means to discredit his persona or to antagonize his life's work, but rather to highlight a point a fellow compañero made last month on another anniversary of Monsignor's death. They posted, "He was in his late 50s when he realized he was on the wrong side of history. He chose to be with the people. People can change." I'll say this again. People can change. We just have to have faith in them. Liberation theology in Latin America emerged in response to massive poverty and social injustice. Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez presented liberation theology as a rationale for performing pastoral work among the poor. The church remained the only force that resisted the military by harboring persecuted individuals. It also served as a mediator between the government and rebel groups. It critiqued the existence of massive poverty and denounced unjust social structures as sinful. Beginning in the late 1960s, in an effort to come closer to the people, Thousands of Catholic sisters and priests moved out of traditional convents and religious houses and into poor neighborhoods to share the living conditions of the people. The initial impulse was pastoral rather than directly political. It was partly a recognition that the church's resources had been disproportionately devoted to the middle and upper classes, especially through schools which depended on tuition payments. In their concern to avoid any paternalism, they found the educational approach of concientización, consciousness raising, developed by the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, to be made to order. Evangelization, quote unquote, evangelization itself, within these group reflections urged people to look for root causes. They had a radicalizing effect. In rural areas, these discussions would often move from immediate problems towards matters such as land tenure, and from there to class structure. Consciousness raising leads naturally to organization. Priests and sisters generally avoided being leaders or spokespersons for the people, but rather sought to stimulate people to form and run their own organizations. While it is true that Monsignor Romero never explicitly regarded himself as a liberation theologian, as he often explained that his preferential option for the poor was driven by his faith rather than ideological currents, at the end of the day, the extreme shift in his praxis and perspective occurred as a result of the monstrosities he witnessed as he assumed the role of Archbishop of San Salvador in 1977, and how the violence began to affect even those closest to him, including himself. His quote-unquote evangelization, or rather his concientización, or rude awakening, following the murders of fellow pastors, including Fathers Rutilio Grande, and the phone rang. It was his good friend. With my most sincere condolences, I would like to communicate two things to you. The first, that the government had absolutely nothing to do with this occurrence. And the second, that we will carry on a thorough investigation to find the killers. It was midnight when Monsignor Romero arrived to see him dead. He approached the small table where we put him, covered by a white blanket. And he just kept staring at him in a way that proved how much he loved him too. We didn't know Monsignor. It was the first time we heard him preach. When we heard him, much to our surprise, it was Father Grande's voice. That's what we all said. It seemed as though Father Rutilio had transitioned into Monsignor, right there before our eyes. I swear. Could it be that God brought about this miracle so that we would not be orphaned? The death of Father Octavio Ortiz Luna. The Isidro Menendez morgue was famous. That's where the bodies went after they were found on the streets, in the ditches, or in the garbage dumps of San Salvador. There were times when there were 6, 7, 8 of them every day. The garbage truck would pick them up and take them there until someone came to identify them. Sometimes no one came. They were afraid of reprisals. That's where they took Father Octavio and the 4 boys after the National Guard killed them in El Despertar. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. I went with my father Beto, who had been a friend of Father Octavio since I was a girl. We went to the morgue looking for our dead. The entrance was totally militarized. Monsignor Romero arrived at the same time we did, and he went in right away, racked with sorrow. Where are they? Where are they? No one stopped him or anything. The guardsmen just looked at him from the door, curious to see the Archbishop going into such a place of ghosts. We went in behind him. The floor was one big puddle of blood. 5 of them were there thrown on the floor. Streams of blood were still coming out of them. Where is Octavio? Here, Monsignor. This is him. they pointed to him. You couldn't even tell it was him. His body was completely flattened, his face destroyed to the point that it looked like he didn't even have one. I had seen Father Octavio in my house eating with my father so many times, and I couldn't even recognize him. Monsignor knelt on the ground and held his shattered head. It can't be. This isn't him. It's not him. Tears streamed from Monsignor's face as he held him with deep tenderness. I can't believe that they could be so savage, he said. The guardsman looked through the door. Monsignor's cassock was covered with blood, and he was crying, cradling Father Octavio in his arms. Octavio, my son, you have completed your mission. You were faithful. In the end, the point I would really like to make is that it took a long time for Romero to reach a concientización. And what finally made him wake up were the grotesque assassinations of Fathers Rutilio and Octavio and of his pueblo, his people. And of course, the multiple death threats he received that, alas, turned out to be real and tragically ended his life. And although he was unable to complete his life's mission to defend his pueblo, to denounce the system that was oppressing his people and causing so much pain and misery, post-mortem, he was so much stronger. He is so much stronger. His activism was so much more palpable. He became the soul and conviction of his pueblo, and he truly did resurrect in the Salvadoran people. And right now that we are living such tense moments where we just want to give up and throw in the towel because it just seems that no one is listening or caring, we cannot give up. We have a responsibility to keep uplifting popular education projects and the social movement, because just as we witnessed through Monsignor Romero, the radicalization of minds is possible. It just takes work. Nothing ever comes easy, and oftentimes it can be very intimidating and scary. Compañeros have died doing this work, but all we can do is uphold their legacy and keep pushing forward. Thank you.
The lights. Thank you.
Thank you for those words, Gonzalo. I think this is a really important moment for us to think about this question of transformation, as we're seeing a lot of what the world that we thought existed really isn't. And what does that mean for each one of us, each one of ourselves? I do a lot of accompaniment work with the dignified Palestinian people, the dignified Zapatista people in Chiapas. And so doing that work at the same time has really had me confront this question of spirituality. And I hadn't been prepared for that, because a lot of the time in our movements on the left and social justice movements, we don't like to talk about religion or spirituality, and a lot of us have a lot of trauma. It's very understandable. And at the same time, we need to talk about it if we're going to talk about how do we build a world where many worlds fit, rather than a world where just one world fits. And so in thinking about this question of liberation theology and its history to Catholicism, which is a very painful history on these lands, and not just these lands, it's a really great challenge for us to move outside of our comfort zones in trying to figure out how do we talk about each other's worlds in a way where we can ask this question: how can we share the world together with all of our difference? With Catholicism, we need to, of course, recognize that Catholicism has been a colonial spiritual warfare on these lands, a holy war. Queen Isabella's holy war, who I can only understand as the original Osama bin Laden. Like, when this country talks about holy war, they don't talk about 1492. And in 1492, before Columbus reached here, already the Catholic monarchs were ethnically cleansing the Iberian Peninsula of Muslims and Jews and forcing everybody to convert. They had the Inquisition already happening, and it heightened after that. And then January 2nd, 1492 marks that moment. There was also a lot of torture, burning of books. So the things that the Europeans did to the native communities here, they were already doing to each other there. And so then, in thinking of this question of transformation, the story of the liberation theologians, whether they call themselves that or not, that had been raised by the Catholic Church, and then learned to humble down and learn from the communities and on these lands, the native communities largely on these lands, and not just learning from them, but living with them, like you described, the importance of sharing the material conditions of poverty. In Chiapas, with the Zapatistas, this is part of a prehistory of the Zapatista, but not an overdetermined history. It's really important to recognize that in speaking about liberation theology in Chiapas, and they say this all the time, it is not to absolve the church at all. It is to recognize the transformation of the priests, of the catechists, and there are very, very clear stories that can help us understand that transformation. And examples of those are when the priests were listening to the confessions of the Tojolabal people in Chiapas, as a specific example. They would hear very strange confessions. For example, the people would say, "Forgive me, Father, I threw the pot. I was not respectful to the pot. Forgive me, Father, I did not visit the milpa. The milpa gets sad when you don't visit her every day." And this was really confusing to them. And the ones that decided to learn were able to then understand that in the Tojolabal cosmovision, everything lives. Everything, including the pot. And therefore, everything must be respected. So there isn't a division between the human and the non-human, where the human has the rights and then the non-human earth has no rights and can be exploited. That itself is the slippery slope of racialization, because not everybody then qualifies as this human who has rights. And that's where we get enslavement and exploitation and this sort of enormous poverty that still exists on these lands. There is a story of a wonderful writer who has transitioned since, and most of his books are in Spanish. And we're trying to translate some of his work. His name is Carlos Lenkersdorf. He was a theologian from Europe who ended up in Mexico, and in the 70s was asked by Samuel Ruiz to translate the Bible into Tojolabal with his partner Gudrun, I believe is her name. I apologize if I'm messing it up. But they didn't know Tojolabal, so they had to learn Tojolabal. And in that learning, the key to it was humility, knowing that one can learn from others who don't have these titles, these degrees, don't even speak, your language or your language, quote unquote, properly. And in that process of learning is how he was able to pull out the cosmovision of the Tojolabal people. And then when we recognize that, then we can start reading in the prayers and the lessons of the catechists under this maybe umbrella that we might call liberation theology of the time, of the 70s and the 80s. We can read power. We can read power in the way that the Zapatistas talk to us about power today. So with the liberation theologians, the catechists learned not to impose the word of God on the communities, but to look for the word of God in the everyday practices of the people. The word of God is already there. And how that translates today with Zapatista political theory, as we might call it, is the understanding of power, of different qualities and circulations of power. A lot of the time when they talk about the power that dominates, that imposes, the Zapatistas will capitalize the P, capital P power, power over. And when they talk about the power to create things together, the potentials that we have, they lowercase it to power lowercase p. And what they want to do in their political project is to never impose a way on anybody. And this is why they don't take the state. And for a lot of leftists, this upsets them. And so the Zapatistas have made a conceptual split for us that there is a left from above and a left from below. And they are the left from below. They are from below and to the left. And this question of left is not a dogma, it's not an ideology, it's an ethical posture against injustice. And so it doesn't have a label. It's an ethical posture against injustice. And this is where the importance of the question of spirituality, of cosmovision, of religion, of ideology, whatever it is that we call it, this question of ethics is so central. And what I have found in trying to understand it myself and understand how do we build a world where many worlds fit, this question of ethics is how do we relate to each other? How do we relate to ourselves? In some of the prayers from Chiapas and lessons and readings at the time in the 70s and 80s, you hear them say, we must not crush others and we must not crush ourselves. So it's at once the other and the self. And the collective, the community is the central force rather than the individual, which is the central force, the central actor under capitalism, especially the individual who under some sort of selfish kind of vibe is supposed to then uplift everybody, and we've seen that does not happen. It's a fantasy, it's a delusion that happens. And at the same time, it's not about making everybody the same in the collective. The Zapatista women say we are equal because we are different, rather than we are equal when we reach a certain standard. When there is a standard to equality like the dominant world that we live in today, introducing a standard introduces inequality. When there isn't a standard for equality, when we begin with the premise that we are already equal, because we are different, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that we tolerate difference. It means that we are powerful because of our differences rather than in spite of our differences. It is understanding that the true biodiversity of the earth also extends to the biodiversity of the human species. And it is in that diversity where we can be strong. And the collective constellation of difference needs us to be ourselves rather than what somebody else wants us to be. And when we can be ourselves, then we can be our unique selves. And in collective, living into our powers, into our gifts, sharing those with others, that is that strength of that diversity, of that difference. Carlos Lenkersdorf's books, probably one of the most famous ones is called Los Hombres Verdaderos, the True Humans. This is from the Topolaval cosmology, Tohol means true. So it's the language of the true, the people with this whole concept of true. And true is not a static kind of category. True is an instant. And a famous, beautiful example I think we might all be able to relate to is when they call the tortilla, the true tortilla. The true tortilla is the one that just comes off of the comal and has a little steam, you know. And you know, then after like a couple seconds, it stops being true. So it's like an aspiration, right? It's so then to be a true human, the Zapatistas talk about how they have a military. Their soldiers are not true humans because they wield a weapon. And wielding that weapon makes it so that might equals right. And that is not a true human. And that is why they fight for a world where there are no armies, so that the soldiers don't have to be soldiers anymore, so that they can just be who they're going to be, who they are. So these kinds of concepts, that book, Los Hombres Verdaderos, was written in the early 90s and was the book that in Mexico people were reading to try to understand the uprising in Chiapas. There's also Aprender a Escuchar, learning to listen. Not just hearing, but listening. And it's really listening to the heart, like what are you feeling? I know you're saying something, but I can feel that you're feeling something else that you might not be saying. So learning to listen. I'm gonna read an excerpt from a chapter called Exodus in Chiapas, that's Central Catechism of Liberation, Ocosingo, 1972. It's in a book called Rebellion in Chiapas by Womack. And in this chapter, Exodus in Chiapas, there's an introduction of this wave of liberation theology in Chiapas in the 70s. And it also translates, it's in English, it translates songs and lessons and prayers. And so I want to read just one reading that talks about the self and the relationship to money, to capital. In everyday life, in many of our homes and communities, we probably hear que el dinero es el demonio, that money is the devil. So it's something to consider in listening to this text, and not only this text, also in trying to understand why the Zapatistas are anti-capitalist. Capitalism not just being the exchange of goods. Capitalism being a system that thrives off of that division of the human and the non-human. That is, again, a slippery slope, because that human on top is not Homo sapiens. It's a political human. It's the ones who can live up to the standard of what it means to be human. And that is that enormous violence that capitalism continues to reproduce. So this reading. Is it true that we are no longer Indians? Brothers, what I'm going to tell you here is what I said with Brother Manuel, who no longer wants to be our Indian brother. Last Sunday, I was walking along, carrying my bag, headed for the colony to go to church with my community. On the road, I met Manuel, who lives on the farm on the other side of the river. He was coming riding his horse, wearing his pants and his new shirt, his good hat, and his fine shoes. I said to him, "Good morning, Brother Manuel. How is your heart?" "Hello, Indito," little Indian. He answered me in Castilla. I said to him, "Are you not Indian too? Maybe you are not Manuel, son of my Uncle Tomas, who is of our Indian race?" "Yes, I am Manuel, and I am the owner of that farm on the other side of the river. I am the owner of those cattle you see in the pasture. I am the owner of that land where the boys from the colonies go to make some money." But I am not Indian like you, he told me. I do not know how to speak your language. My language is Castilla. Castilla is how in Chiapas, the words, and not just Chiapas, but Spanish. Isabella of Castilla. Queen Isabella was from Castilla. Boy, do not say that my papa is your uncle. My family does not deal with Indians. I answered him, yes, your father is my uncle. Your father did the same work in the corn patch and planting beans as all the men of my race do. I told him, some years ago, your father also wore white cotton country clothes and sandals. Together, my father and he took candles to the festival of San Tomas. Then he laughed and said to me, you stupid Indian, you are Catholic. That is why you are poor. You are wasting your time. It is from going off to pray that you have no cattle, no farm, or animals, or money. It is from going around praying that you do not know Castilla, and you speak your language that no one understands. Better stop praying. Get out of your colony that is so poor and come to my farm to make some money. Become Ladino, and you will see how you make money. Stop believing in God, because money is what is useful. Your God is of no use. God is money. When I heard all this that Manuel was telling me, I felt angry and sad. I told him I did not want to work on his farm. I have a special duty in my colony, and I told him goodbye. Along the road here, I kept thinking about many things, and I asked myself many questions like these. Is it true that we Indians, to be able to live comfortably, have to scorn our race? Is it true that to be able to grow, we have to forget our language and crush our brothers? In the colony, we do work for the community, school, pastures, paths, but we do not do it with pleasure. We do it out of fear and obligation. I believe that is because we do not like our race. We think the will of God is that we will always be poor. That is not so. God wants us all to get out of poverty together. Brothers, I believe in God, and I believe it is possible that with the work of all of us united, we may come to be a great people, a respected Indian people, where we may live as brothers. We must keep the wealth God gave us from rotting in the hands of the rich, or from being lost in the hands of those who are not capable of using it for the good of all. So I just want to then wrap up with a couple of thoughts that have helped me, or are helping me clarify my relationship to especially the three Abrahamic faiths. I'll share a story. I'm currently finalizing a manuscript, a book called Palestine 1492, a report back. And it begins with some journal entries from when I was living in Palestine, in Bethlehem in 2010 to 2011. And I was living just steps away from the Nativity Church, where they say Jesus of Nazareth was born. And I lived on Star Street, which is a street where the procession goes through every Christmas. And my neighbor, I was at my neighbor's little shop where she sold, candy, little things. And there were these two identical twin boys that come, 10 years old. And I was like, wow, twins. And she said, no, 3. She didn't know I didn't understand Arabic very much. So I was like, not 2. She's like, no, 3. Musa, Isa, Muhammad. That's their names. Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Those are the 3 prophets. Moses of Judaism, Jesus of Christianity, and Muhammad of Islam. And this is in Bethlehem, and this is a Christian family who named their triplet identical boys those names. And I only saw two of them at this, I never saw all three, and sometimes I would only see one, and there was this one that would make faces at me and like throw things at me, and then like I'd fight back, you know? And then, almost 9 months later, I'm walking at night on Star Street, heading home. And I see the three of them coming at me, and I can't believe it. Oh my God. I mean, there really are three. And then a little boy was with them. I was so focused on the three, and I was like, well, we're walking. I don't know if this one's going to throw something at me. Like, are we just going to pass? And then, instead of throwing something at me, he hands it to me, and it's a flower. And he introduces himself. His name is Muhammad. And I introduce myself as Kiki, and I meet the other two, Isa and Musa. And we talk a little bit, and then I head out going home with my little flower, and I feel so happy that, that I met all three of them, and that the interaction was very kind. And then as I'm walking away, one of the triplets picks up flowers from the ground, because I had asked, where did this flower come from? And they're like, it's Bella, trash. It's like, okay, cool, I still love the flower. And it turns out that someone had thrown some flowers on the ground, and as I'm leaving, one of the triplets picks up some flowers and starts throwing them at me. And it's Isa, it's Jesus. And I was like, oh, it's Jesus who's mad at me. All right. That makes sense. And I fight back. And then Muhammad picks up a flower from the ground and gives me a second flower. And I thought about that story recently because I'm putting it in my book, and in my diary entry, I was like so happy that I met all three, and that Muhammad and Musa had given Isa a very good example of being nice. And that maybe next time Isa and I ever we confront each other, it will smile at each other. And many years later now, I can reflect on that and recognize that I was able to smile at Jesus. I had met the Marxist Christians and the anarchist Christians, and they told me about a different Jesus, a revolutionary Jesus. And Palestinians understand Jesus also as revolutionary, as a martyr, as someone who died for their cause, for their life. And it made me realize that with religion, like with our movements, whether we call them secular or not, and it may be just because of the human condition that we're constantly being pulled toward this power over or power to. And this is in Islam. Also, a brother of mine in struggle, Muhammad Abdul, just came out with a book called Islam and Anarchism, where he's an example of this. There are the Jewish liberation theologians who are trying to fight back, have been trying to fight back against Zionism for decades, because they understand that as a fascist hijacking of Judaism. Just like with Constantine and the Roman Empire's co-optation of Christianity, they call Zionism a Constantinian Judaism. The empire hijacked it. So we have these tensions between empire and the earth. And so how are we going to meet each other, right? Who are fighting with the earth, for the earth, are of the earth, rather than of empire. Frantz Fanon, great revolutionary thinker, wrote a book called The Wretched of the Earth. I think we also need to understand there is a wretched of the empire as well. And which one do we want to be? I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Let's hear it again for our presenters. really amazing. We do want to be sensitive for the time, but we also want to open it up for a little discussion. So if anybody has questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get to you.
But silence is golden.
Sure. I'm just curious if I'm getting hints of it throughout both of you speaking. First, I guess I want to say thank you both for speaking. That was really interesting. But I was wondering, from both of your perspectives, sort of how, if you could explain liberation theology, like if I was a fight, like a fifth grader. Like simple terms, walk me through it, like I would really appreciate that.
We can live recognizing each other as superior versus inferior, above and below. And we can keep having that fight where if you're below and I'm above, you fight me for my position above and then I fall below. So we're in this circle of above and below. With liberation theology, the point is to escape that, ward away from that, and be side by side. Side by side with your difference. So for example, just the way that we look under a situation of empire, under a situation of oppression and domination, we would be ranked. Where a certain skin color or a certain gender would be above and the other below. With liberation theology, the move is to try to get over to a place where when we encounter each other and we're different, we're just different.
Yeah, I'm thinking my fifth grade mind. It's really hard. So long ago. I think to keep it as basic as possible, it's just to be willing to help one another, to be willing to work with one another without setting any structures or hierarchy, right? Trying to be as horizontal as possible in the way we behave and the way we connect with one another. And I think that from the moment we are born, that's already made difficult, right? Because we are categorized right away, right? Male or female, our name, our race, even our weight, things like that matter. So trying to break it down to someone that young, I mean, it would just be teaching the quality of respect between people. I think that's how I perceive liberation theology.
To use that phrase also, liberation theology is a little, it's kind of like a school of thought, and so there's the school of thought, and then there's the ethical posture, I think that we both described, right? So when thinking about an ethical posture of each other, there are so many worlds on this beautiful planet that have these kinds of conceptions. Like in Africa, the Bantu people, that I am we. I am we. In Lakesh, you are my other me. The collective, the community is possible, knowing that we could all potentially be each other according to whatever context we land in, right? Like, so when we think about resistance and struggle and fighting the monsters that oppress us, we also need to think about how do we not become the monsters that we fight? Because we can. There are a lot of seductions, especially in these times of survival. How do we not become those monsters? How do we create a world where we don't become monsters? Where we don't reward those horrible tendencies we all have just as being human beings, our sociopathies, and instead reward the behaviors that we'd like in order to live in closer harmony and balance with each other. Is that fifth grade?
Yeah, I took it all.
Mama, that's like college.
Right, how valuable do you see Christian liberation theology working hand in hand with Indianismo, not through a left posture, but through an Indianista ethical posture, which is a non-left ethical posture, because Indianismo is for the liberation of Indian mothers in the Western Hemisphere. So Indianismo is for the use of usos y costumbres, customs and traditions of the Indian people in the Western Hemisphere. So that automatically eliminates the left ethical posture and takes an Indianista ethical posture, like I said, based on cultures and traditions. So how viable is a Christian left which takes a left posture to link up with an Indianista perspective from the communities of the Western Hemisphere for the purpose of liberating the Indian mother, either for the creation of an Indian nation state or an Indian state within a nation state, an existing nation state, or 100% sovereignty of Indian people within an existing nation state? The two possibilities: the creation of a bona fide Indian nation state, or sovereignty within a nation state. Two possibilities. How viable do you see that between the two?
I think it's complicated. I mean, I feel like I don't even have to go too far. I can go back to talk about Monsignor and how that was one of his major complications throughout most of his priesthood, right? He was never able, well, I shouldn't say that, but he had a really hard time putting himself in the shoes of the people. In fact, I think that in his younger years, he never really categorized himself as the poor, right? After all, he did have a privilege of going to Rome, going to school, something that the majority of the people who are of indigenous ancestry, right, the majority of the Salvadorian populace, did not have access to. In fact, they barely had access to food. So I think that what I'm thinking with what you're saying is that what is the greatest challenge is this inevitable hierarchical system that we are just completely connected to at this point. We have to break that down entirely. And I don't see that happening, especially in the interest of Christianity. I mean, again, thinking about Monsignor, that power, letting go of the power, the challenge that priests and the Vatican and Rome had with that was probably what created a much difficult situation for the people, not just in El Salvador, but throughout the region, right? That's why there was that meeting in Medellin, because first and foremost, we had to think about the people, but if that was the case, then why did the Vatican reject it so much? And it is because the people were not the main interest. It was holding power that remained the interest. And so I don't see it being something I don't see it being something easy to do, right? To break that down, to have them work together. I would have to just rethink this whole system, right? And going back to what you were saying, like the fact that we are people or individuals living within this capitalist system that really pushes into our psyche competition, first and foremost, and seeing ourselves as individuals versus collective, I think that is the greater issue. That is the greatest problem. That is what we have the responsibility of completely dismantling. And I don't know that we're prepared to do that, right? I mean, can I ask you tonight if you have ideas of how to even begin to do that? But what I will say, and what I really appreciate from my compañera's presentation is this whole idea of spirituality, right? Because we're often very much disconnected from that. And I think that's what I appreciate so much about learning about Monsignor is just that his spirituality was connected to trying to help people. He didn't know how to. He was very much confused about it, in fact. But he made an effort, and it took him a while. I mean, 27 to, he began his priesthood in 44. He was murdered in 80. His concientización happened in the mid-70s. So, I mean, you do the math.
On the question of viable, maybe it's viable, but I would rather engage it if it's desirable. Is it desirable to have these lands not have a leftist posture, but just an identitarian posture? And in the context today of planetary emergency with climate collapse that is coming at the hands of capital, that is not desirable, because anyone with any identity today can be accepted to become the wretched of the empire. And I will say Evo Morales, sadly, is indigenous, but he is not of the earth. He's extractivist, so this is the challenge that we're in when we focus first on identity. We need to focus on the context of power above, power below. How is power circulating, and how are those identities shuffling? Because under a multicultural capitalism, any identity can be acceptable as long as they're not leftist, as long as they're not for the earth. And again, when I use this word leftist, I'm using it as an ethical posture against injustice. I'm not using it as a specific ideology like Marxist or feminist or lo que sea. Yeah, so the question of identity is important, but identity shifts in context. So there's not an identity that is always oppressor or always victim, and I think we learned that with Palestine. The Zapatistas have a famous communique from 1994. The PS starts with Marcos is gay. Marcos is gay in San Francisco, Black in South Africa, Asian in Europe, Jew in Germany, Palestinian in Israel. Context shifts. Marcos is with the below. And Palestinians can be above, and in fact, Palestinians are split, where some of them want to be with the empire and some of them want to be with the earth, just like all of our communities and all of our worlds are having this tension right now and these seductions.
I just want to follow up. Maybe it's easier for Islam, liberation theology, to work hand in hand with Uality. Because I think that the Christian liberation theology is perhaps more immersed with the left stance as opposed to Muslim liberation theology. I could be wrong. I don't know much about, the Islam tradition, but it seems that they would not embrace so much the left, because the Christianity is more involved with European ideology, so to speak, and Islam is not involved so much with, they're not involved with European ideology, even though they're Ibrahimic, just like Christianity is in Judaism. So maybe the possibility to work with the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm just saying that it seems that
Malcolm X is an example of liberation Islam. In Islam and Anarchism, that book from Muhammad Abdul, he talks about Islam itself in the days of Muhammad being this leftist ethical posture against injustice, and after his death, with all of these fights over succession and power, it has lost its way. It has been hijacked by empire, the caliphates, for example. also with Christianity, and also with Judaism now with Israel, for example. So I think I do, I mean, I'm in a debate with my compas all over the country, all over the world, over using this word left. Should I still use this word left? And they're like, we need to stop using the word left. It is dead, it's destroyed, it doesn't mean anything. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna keep trying. And I might call you in a couple months and let you know that it failed. But I think it's helpful to at least try with this conceptual split that Zapatistas have provided of a left from above and left from below. Because there's an above and a below, but the below isn't necessarily trying to be a liberation movement. It's trying to get the bag. It's trying to go above. You know, like we have a below that becomes fundamentalist. That and so what is that wants to be capitalist too, right? And so then what is the ethical position, the political ethics that are gonna have us come together? While all of our worlds can be our worlds and all of their difference, cool, but what is it that at those moments when we share the world, what is the ethical position we're going to have? And that is why I use left, until someone can come up with a better way to talk about it. Because I do think it's important that we not just talk about the below, because a lot of the time the desires of the below are to go above, because those are the only options we're given when we're being crushed, is to go above, to snitch, to be collaborate, to assimilate, all of those ways that we go above. So if anyone would love to or can offer something about this, because this is a conundrum that we're in. See, just to give us someone this other quote again.
I just want to say this. It was a great experience to actually be here and hear both of you guys. The stories that you guys have both mentioned, they close each other so well. You had mentioned Romero at the age of 50 realized that I need to be with people. And your story, tying that with self-spirituality, tying those two together, the fact that it took them the age of 27 to 50 to acknowledge that is a journey. That's a journey for self. And tying that with, just the mathematical, 27 to 50, just off the top, it is quite an exceptional time in itself. So, one thing that I studied was different types of religion. And Malcolm X was a great role model of mine, as well as Romero. At a young age, imagine in the 5th grade, ironically, picked up both books, and at that moment, it awakened something in my mind. And from then on, I had a different knowledge and a different way of thinking. And one thing I will say, tying back to Malcolm X, I studied both Islam. I went to Catholic school. I studied Buddhism. I read Hinduism. I love to learn. And with that, I had learned within the Supreme Mathematics of the time next to Romeros. There's 3 levels that you have to start off with in order to understand, to be with the people. And it starts with number 1, with knowledge. With knowledge comes wisdom, and then with wisdom comes understanding. Thus, once we know Romeros understood at the age of 50. So we need to do the knowledge to grow the wisdom and to have the understanding. So that's how the 2 concepts tie together. So the stories you guys brought together will help put together. And I just want to compliment both of you guys tonight for everything.
When you were speaking about the confessions and the apologizing for throwing the pot, I thought that was an interesting concept that I had usually heard in more Eastern philosophy, kind of non-duality maybe, along those lines. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, because I think it's an important concept that brings together solidarity and unity. And when we're talking about differences of religions and these things, that concept of non-duality kind kind of shines above all of them, and connects what we are as human being first, you know, even above all these aspects, because religion can often be of the tongue and the spirituality is of the heart, you know, and then when we use those religions as a roadmap, you know, and you might find the right map for you in whichever one you do, but if you're just religious, you can go to church on Sunday, get home from work on Monday and kick the dog, you right? And so how do we kind of turn that into an all-pervasive, every moment practice, you know? And I was wondering if you could maybe expand on that pot.
The everyday practice, and what is, right, the pot, you're cooking, and that you throw a pot, that says something about the self, right?
Yeah.
How you treat the pot.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, this question of duality, because duality itself can be binary and it can be fluid. So like when we think about lightness and darkness, European philosophy seems to get stuck that light is always good and dark is always bad. Always. It's like stuck in the binary, where sometimes lightness, we use this word like, you know, I'm going to send you some light, or those are dark times, to say like, you know, good or bad. But that's not always the case. And not only that, it's not binary. There aren't just good guys versus bad guys. All of us could be bad guys. All of us could be good guys, you know, so there's a fluidity. So that the fluidity of the duality is closer to Mesoamerican philosophy. And this gender, for example, we're usually taught that gender is a role, and it is an imposed role, and it's a binary. And this is from the Western canon of philosophical thought. In Mesoamerican philosophy, or the cosmology, cosmovision, gender is an energy. There's a divine feminine, the divine masculine, and the feminine is internal, the masculine is external, and we have both. And some of them are more intense in some spots, and some are more intense outwardly or not. And this is not just Mesoamerican philosophy, this is also African Yoruba spirituality talks about the energies in this way. So there's a fluidity. We can have dualities that are fluid and side by side, rather than binary and above and below. So I think that the throwing of the pot, in thinking that a pot is alive, because we're usually taught that, okay, plants, yes, okay, fungi, yes, other animals, yes, but a pot, it really is, at the very, very least, even if folks may not want to understand something bigger than themselves, at the very least, it's about the self, how you relate to the world all around you in your everyday life, what kind of energies you put out into the world in everyday life.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, and I would maybe just add to that is that when we express ourselves against the pot, we're causing that trauma on ourselves really only, and creating a habitual practice that we might not take out on the pot next time, and we're reinforcing that. So it's a strong, powerful practice to treat ourselves and how we express ourselves outwardly, consciously, even against the pot.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
Beautifully
Cool.
said.
I just want to thank y'all. I think that everything y'all said was amazing. I actually did not know a lot of the stuff you mentioned about Mr. Romero. And it's really human to err and take so long to find a way. Growing up, I heard a lot about him because Mr. Romero married my grandparents. My grandparents are from San Miguel, and he was a priest in one of the churches there. And my grandma was an avid supporter, and just really connected with his life story and with his homilia. But it's really refreshing to hear this other part, where we don't hear that in the South hear about these saints or about these people, you never hear their human part where they were like, he was very privileged in some ways, you know. And I really like the way you tell stories. Thank you so much. It's very amazing.
Yeah, I have a question about just from like the phrase from above or from below. So that really makes me think about a lot of things. And so but I think you mentioned like separatistas, for example, they maybe don't want to take state power or something like that. So I'm wondering, like more generally, broadly, like how does liberation theology? How is it discussing like the idea of a state or a government? Like, were they supporting of these kind of ideas, or like how did they accommodate into their thinking?
I think what I'm understanding, just from the practice that priests and nuns embraced, is that they didn't want to be a lead for these people, for the people. They wanted people to learn from their own livelihoods. They wanted people to be able to establish their own organizations, their own communities, and their own thinking based on their experience, based on perhaps their consciousness of the inequality, the poverty they came from, where they come from. Because what it seems to me is that many people didn't have that conciencia. Many people just accepted that they didn't have enough food to eat because that's just the way God wanted it, right? And I feel like what the church was doing at this time was making it so that little by little, providing them with resources and spaces to engage in conversation and storytelling, they started understanding their position in society, separate from this structure, right, that was keeping them at the bottom. Because, and that's another thing that they were realizing, is that they were getting paid pennies to work 7 days a week, right, and still were going hungry, and their children were dying. So what good did the government do to these people, right? So I do feel like these theologians were not embracing government systems, and in Salvador, for instance, they did not like these military dictatorships, obviously, right? And I think that's the beef that people had with Monsignor, because he would party with them. He would go to these galas with these rich families, right? He would host private masses for these people, the baptism, etc. Meanwhile, people were barely making ends meet and being killed for speaking out, right? For building a consciousness about the inequality and oppression that they were undergoing. So.
I kind of piggyback. Go ahead. Oh, kind of piggybacking off of the above and below. I'm really curious about how that goes into play with the concept of like a supreme being such as God, right? An all-knowing above figure who, I'm curious how those two things play together.
With my spirituality, is I'm a student of my spirituality with a teacher in Guatemala, and he clarifies that God, excuse me, as that term, it's very, as we know, it's difficult. Translation is difficult because words that might mean something in one world don't mean the same in another world. And this word God kind of has become the word that we all use as the divine, or as creator, or as force. And it is really important to clarify that for the Maya, God is not a man, is not, this old man with a beard, or God is energy, intelligence, and love, all three. not just one of those. And so it's a force that is not just energy, it's a force that is also, the love part is the community part, the kindness part. And the intelligence part is really seeking to get to our greatest selves and our potentials with all of the complexity that we have. So the question then of like above and below, it matches more the spirituality of empire. Because even in Christianity, the more liberation forms of Christianity also understand God as a force, not necessarily as a man, and believe that this figure of the man was created by a patriarchal society to school people into following the state, following the king, following the father, following the lord, the landlord, in that way. And so the move toward understanding God as a force that's divine and isn't mapped onto this figure is more liberatory. It's also not to say that people who believe that God is a man have it wrong either. It's not to say that this religion is wrong and this religion is right. But for the Maya, it makes a lot of sense that a critique of above and below comes from Maya philosophy, political theory, spirituality, because the divine does not work that way.
I just wanted to share my appreciation for both of y'all, Karla and Lisa. I have a curious question. I'm not sure, Lisa, you might have more information, but the reason why I thought of it was because the person that was asking about the plot reminded me of the practice I did when I was meditating and of being present and of how, I don't know, it just made me think of how being present with yourself helps you be present with everything around and find the sacredness of everything. I was just curious if there's like liberation theology based on Eastern religions, or like if you know something about that. I guess I'm just curious if like there's some connections there.
I am not well read on Eastern religions other than just the bit of Islam that I know and Eastern Christianity. Does anyone maybe in the room maybe might have a lot more information about it?
I've heard from some Muslims that there is some current within Islamic, within Islam that is embracing liberation theology. Their style, just like the evangelical, so-called Protestant Catholic, has taken their own current and applied it to liberation theology. That's what I heard from Muslims. And just to kind of like answer your question, was there an alternative to a left stance? My humble opinion is that there is. And again, I say that it's Indianism. Indianism is a stance that is egalitarian within the Aboriginal Western world, within the Western Hemisphere. It doesn't take a hierarchical structure. It's non-European. It has the way Indianism is. It's a communal type of stance where everybody's the same, and it's not a socialist stance. We have to understand that it's very important that we understand Indianismo based on usos y costumbres, customs and traditions, which is traditional lifestyle of Indian people, versus socialism, which comes from Europe. So, to answer your question, in my humble opinion, Indianismo within the Western world, within the Western Aboriginal people, there will be Indianismo, and for any other people around the world that are Aboriginal, whatever they want to call that stance based on usos y costumbres, that would be, in my humble opinion, the alternative to the so-called left or right in the European political ideology.
Hi, I'm Miss Rachel. I'm not one person. So much compacted, but I think the most important thing to capture is that, as students, we're not, we don't all, exist the same, we're not all one community, right? I'm an Nahuatl person from close to Santa Ana, 50 miles away, there's another Nahuatl community, we don't get along, you know what I mean? So, there's no such thing as convenience, okay? And when we fall into the trap of seeing us as outsiders especially, people looking into our communities and looking at us as a monolith, that's where we kind of get tracked down the road of costumbres and what it means, traditions, and it's just not, we don't all do it the same. So you can't generalize.
On the east, this, and to maybe secularize what we're talking about, the dialectical materialism, dialectical idealism, the dialectic, and we're talking about duality, right, and the pot, and how throwing the pot transforms the pot and transforms you. That's dialectics. Constant change and whenever there's encounter. And that, my understanding is that the Western philosophers like Hegel got that from the East, the dialectic. And then sadly they made it master-slave dialectics. That's just the way the world is the dialectic is above and below. And didn't talk about dialectic of side by side by side by side by side by side. So there are these tendencies there are these borrowings, I would say, that I'm not schooled at that. I'm not very well read at that, but it did remind me your question and your question about other or Eastern philosophies or Eastern spiritualities, that there is a lot, and yeah, and I do appreciate the recognition that we're not all the same. We have a same identity, but it doesn't mean that we're the same. We move different, and that's why identity kind of becomes limiting in that way. And that's why, like with the tojol tortilla, the true tortilla is a true tortilla just for a moment, and there's that fluidity of a different kind of tortilla to different stages of the tortilla, and just like us. And also just to wrap up too, because when I think about the tojol tortilla and the tojol human, and I think about transformation, I think it's helpful, at least for me it's been helpful to understand that as we're transforming into trying to be the best people that we can be ourselves in this context that we're in, and as someone committed to fighting against injustice, there is a lot of forgiveness that's necessary. Self-forgiveness and forgiveness of the other, and not just by saying, I'm sorry, please forgive me, but in that actual transformation is that forgiveness that makes it possible. The work that we do so that the injustice doesn't happen again, rather than the punitive type of justice. The work that we do so it doesn't happen again, and then that leads to that type of forgiveness that is necessary, and it's a necessary way for us to heal. And I think for me it's been very helpful in seeing my worst enemy, seeing myself in my worst enemy, and not forgetting them just for that, but also making it so that I'm looking at a bigger picture than just the two of us, than just the me. There are forces that are making this encounter toxic. How do we transform these forces to make it healing, to make it loving, So yeah, that's what I wanted to say about. Thank you for that, because you made me think about the dialectic as I'm thinking about the duality.
Yeah, I have something for the East. It's interesting for the Eastern liberation struggle in Eastern philosophy, maybe like Buddhism, which I've studied a little bit of. And you don't see it necessarily in the political correlation, although the liberation is really of the mind, they say. But we can still remember that Tibet is still under control of China. And I was with some Tibetan monks maybe a few years ago, and he was telling me they were facing a lot of violent oppression, and that some of them were lighting themselves on fire in protest and doing these extreme things that we saw Aaron Bushnell do. One person who you can maybe look into who experienced the most recent liberation struggle as a Buddhist is Thich Nhat Hanh, who also coincidentally, maybe not coincidentally, purposefully was also speaking with Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement. After he was banished from Vietnam, came and was a part of the Civil Rights Movement as kind of talking with him and educating him on nonviolence and peace. So there's, all the struggles are related. And I think it's so important that the spirituality awakening is part of the liberation struggle. Otherwise, we replace a system with a new political system, but it's just another system with no love, no interconnectivity. And that's really what sets us all free, is when we see the interconnectivity, when we see ourselves in each other, the humanity. And so I don't think you can have liberation without the spiritual awakening, and they go hand in hand. And so, yeah, it's a great subject and topic, and I appreciate you bringing that up too.
I just had something to say about, I think we should be very careful in analyzing the rhetoric that is used in regards to China. That's all. I think I'm not well read enough to argue for what's going on in the Himalayas or in these parts of the world, but there's a lot of opposing views to what you just said of oppression towards them from China. So I would just analyze all that.
Yeah, it is a complicated position, especially in the United States, because the United States uses anti-China rhetoric. And we need to be careful to not then go to the extreme and as somebody who is anti-empire, I'm not just anti-US empire, I'm anti-all empires, including a multipolar world of empires. And that's a big fight right now in the left, from above versus the left from below. So yeah, we do need to be careful with all of our geographies that we don't homogenize them either way. Homogenize them as oppressive or homogenize them as liberationists, you know. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, actually to speak about empire, I've been doing just like a little bit of reading about like domestication and like the history of these early empires and like the grain cores, as they were called, or maybe they're called something else, but how domestication, like extreme forms of domestication of plants, animals, and then of ourselves, really allowed for empires to solidify and spread. And so it's just, I don't know, just talking about empires, like Homo sapiens, like 95% of our existence was hunting and gathering, and only like the last like 3 to 5% of our existence has been in this empire form. So when people say like, is it possible, and it's just like doing a little bit of reading, I'm like, somehow like you can get back to that 95% of our existence, of our bodies living in different ways. I don't know, that's just been a little seedling of hope that I've been trying to hold on to.
If I may just add this, on that story when I met the triplets, and I said, hopefully Asa and I will smile at each other, I realized that that moment came when I heard a reading from a Christian anarchist circles about the book of Genesis and the Garden of Eden, which harkens to what you said. Their reading is that the Garden of Eden is that hunter-gatherer food forest, and that the wisdom that was forbidden was the wisdom of domestication, of the agriculture that we know today. And that what follows was the killing of Abel by his brother Cain, and Abel was the shepherd and Cain was the city, so the city killed off the country. And that the Bible itself, talking about not homogenizing any one thing, that the Bible, as they tell it, is a bunch of debates. That's why it's contradictory all of the time. It's debates from the above and the below, and the above back to the below. And that's the way to read that text, at least for them. That's how they say that they read it. And that made me smile. That's when I was able to smile at these texts, because I had grown up learning that the Bible should be read literally, rather than metaphorically, rather than allegorically. And this has been a problem also with Islam, where the word of the prophet gets read literally, rather than metaphorically, allegorically. So there is a lot of power in that, and that is the reason why these texts have survived so much, because they have been able to be read metaphorically, allegorically, that then can shift to whatever context that we're in as stories. But when the moment they get engaged as literal historical fact, that's when these fundamentalisms arise. So thank you for that.
One more time for Karla and Quiquivix. Karla, did you want to-
So I would like to extend a special invitation. We are hosting an event next Saturday, April 20th, at Cares in Los Angeles. It is near Koreatown, near downtown. Beginning at 4:30 p.m. It is a report back about the recent unconstitutional Salvadoran elections. We're going to be talking with people that were out observing the elections, their findings, learning about their findings, learning about some of the narratives of the people, the testimonies. What next? What happens, right, when he is sworn in on June 1st? What is the country going to do? How do we fight back? What is the social movement doing to prepare? So we invite you to come to that conversation. Again, it's next Saturday, April 20th at Caresen, beginning at 4:30. And you can find out more on the LA CSPE's Instagram, but I know that Midnight Books will also share it for everyone. So hopefully I'll see some of your faces there. It'll be a really great conversation, and yeah, I hope that I see you.
Thank you all for coming. Please support this space, keep it going so we can have more events like this, and please support CSPES's fundraiser as well in the back to help build homes in El Salvador. Thank you. Good night.